Have you ever stopped to think about how much of who you are was never intentionally taught to you? When people talk about what parents teach their children, they usually think about advice, rules, discipline, or the conversations they remember growing up. But those aren't always the lessons that stay with us. In fact, the most powerful things our parents teach us are often the things they never realize they're teaching. Children are always watching. Long before they fully understand words, they understand patterns. They notice how their parents speak to each other, how they react when they're stressed, what makes them laugh, what makes them angry, what they celebrate, what they ignore, and what they choose to hide. Even when no one is trying to teach them anything, they're constantly learning. A child's greatest classroom isn't what they're told, it's what they witness every single day. A child doesn't need someone to explain what love looks like. They simply watch how love is expressed at home. If affection is shown openly, they begin to believe that's what love is supposed to feel like. If love is distant, unpredictable, or only appears under certain conditions, that too becomes part of their understanding. Not because anyone explained it to them, but because it became the only version of love they knew. The same is true for respect. Children don't learn respect simply because they're told to respect other people. They learn it by watching whether respect exists inside their own home. They notice how disagreements are handled, whether people listen before speaking, whether voices are raised instead of problems being solved, and whether kindness disappears the moment frustration takes over. Those experiences quietly shape what they come to believe is normal. What's remarkable is that parents often teach the biggest lessons during the moments they believe no one is paying attention. A conversation in the kitchen, the way they respond to disappointment, the way they speak about relatives, neighbors, or strangers after they walk away, the way they react when life becomes difficult. None of those moments feel like lessons, yet they often become the lessons children remember the most. That's why so many adults carry beliefs they never consciously chose. They didn't wake up one day and decide how they would view love, trust, conflict, success, or failure. They absorbed those ideas little by little because, as children, they had no reason to question them. Home became their first understanding of how the world worked. And perhaps that's what makes family so powerful. It becomes the first place where we learn what feels normal, not necessarily what is right, not necessarily what is wrong, simply what is familiar. And what feels familiar has a remarkable way of following us long after we've grown up, moved away, and started lives of our own. One of the greatest misconceptions about childhood is believing that children only remember the big moments. In reality, they remember what happened repeatedly. They remember the atmosphere of a home. They remember whether laughter was common or rare. They remember whether problems were discussed or avoided. They remember whether people expressed affection freely or struggled to say, "I love you." Over time, those repeated moments become their definition of what family is supposed to look like. That's why two people can grow up with completely different expectations of life without ever realizing where those expectations came from. One person may believe that asking for help is natural because they grew up in a home where support was always available. Another may believe they have to carry every burden alone because that's all they ever witnessed. Neither of them consciously chose those beliefs. They simply inherited them through observation. The same thing happens with emotions. Some children grow up in homes where sadness is acknowledged, fear is understood, and vulnerability is accepted. Others grow up believing emotions should be hidden, ignored, or dismissed because that's how everyone around them responded. As adults, many people struggle to express what they feel, not because they're incapable, but because they were never shown that emotions could exist without shame or criticism. Children also learn how to respond to mistakes by watching the adults around them. If every mistake is met with patience and understanding, they begin to see failure as part of learning. But if every mistake is met with anger, disappointment, or humiliation, they may grow up believing that making mistakes is something to fear rather than something to learn from. Years later, that fear can still influence the way they approach opportunities, challenges, and even their own ambitions. Perhaps the most unnoticed lesson parents teach is how they treat themselves. Children notice the way their parents speak about their own appearance, their abilities, their dreams, and their worth. They notice whether they constantly criticize themselves or show themselves compassion. Without realizing it, children often adopt that same inner dialogue. The words they hear adults use about themselves can quietly become the words they one day use about themselves. This is why families influence us in ways we rarely recognize. They don't simply shape our memories. They shape our expectations, our habits, our emotional responses, and the way we interpret the world. Many of the things we assume are simply who we are began as silent lessons learned long before we were old enough to understand we were learning them. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about these silent lessons is that they don't disappear simply because we grow older. Time doesn't automatically erase them. Many of them stay with us for years, quietly influencing the way we think, the way we communicate, the way we handle conflict, the way we trust, and even the way we love. That's why so many people reach adulthood believing certain behaviors are simply part of their personality, when in reality, they may be patterns they learned long before they understood they had a choice. This isn't about blaming parents. No parent is perfect, because no human being is perfect. Every parent teaches something they intended to teach, and something they never realized they were teaching. Just as they were shaped by the families they grew up in, they unknowingly pass parts of those experiences on to the next generation. In many ways, every family carries invisible lessons from the generations that came before them. Some of those lessons become strengths worth preserving. Others become patterns that continue simply because no one ever stopped to question them. Maybe that's why understanding our families is so important. It's not about finding someone to blame for who we've become. It's about recognizing that some of the beliefs we've carried for years didn't begin with us. They were quietly handed to us through everyday moments, ordinary conversations, repeated behaviors, and the examples we saw long before we were old enough to understand their influence. The truth is, parents rarely remember every word they said to their children, but children often remember the way those words made them feel. They may forget the exact conversations, but they remember the atmosphere they grew up in. They remember whether home felt safe, whether they felt heard, whether kindness was common, whether forgiveness was practiced, and whether love was something they experienced or something they had to earn. Those memories become the foundation on which many of their future expectations are built. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The things that shape us most are not always the lessons that were spoken. They're the lessons that were lived. Long after the advice has been forgotten, people continue to carry the examples they witnessed every single day. And maybe that's why the things our parents never meant to teach us are often the lessons we remember for the rest of our lives. Thank you for listening. Until next time.